Snow clung to the cedar branches as deputies stepped into the quiet ravine, their breath fogging the air, while a thin line of disturbed frost traced a path no animal would make. And the stillness felt wrong, as if the ground itself was holding a secret that had waited through seasons, calendars, and forgotten winters to be found at last. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The discovery occurred on a gray December morning in northern Idaho, when daylight arrived late and left early, and the county road crews had already salted the curves along Highway 95. A survey crew clearing windfall near a turnout reported an odor and an irregular depression beyond the snow berm. Deputies arrived with cameras, flags, and notebooks, moving slowly, aware that every footprint mattered. The scene revealed the remains of a young woman, partially shielded by brush, the earth hardened by weeks of cold. The county coroner was called, and the area was sealed, not with spectacle but with careful procedure. The woman was later identified as Melissa Ann Rourke, age 22, a cashier at a grocery store in the town of Sandpoint. She had been reported missing the previous spring, a fact that weighed heavily as investigators recognized the seasonal gap. Melissa's identification came from dental records and a distinctive ring found nearby, logged and photographed before transport. The autopsy would suggest death months earlier, with exposure and environmental effects complicating precision. Still, the manner pointed to homicide, and the file was opened with the sober understanding that time had already taken evidence with it. In 1988, Idaho's rural counties relied on handwritten logs, Polaroids, and the institutional memory of deputies who knew the back roads. The sheriff assigned a small team, and they began where the paper trail still existed. Missing person flyers were pulled from archive boxes, their edges yellowed. Melissa's last confirmed sighting placed her leaving work the night before Easter, the store's fluorescent lights reflected on wet pavement. Weather reports showed a late cold snap, snow turning to sleet, conditions that slowed travel and blurred recollections. Investigators reconstructed Melissa's routines with restraint. She lived in a rented room near downtown, walked when weather allowed, and occasionally accepted rides. Her family described a cautious young woman saving for community college, not transient, not reckless. Bank records showed no unusual withdrawals. Her car, a faded blue sedan, remained parked where she left it. There was no sign she planned to leave town, and no evidence of self-harm. The case settled into the uncomfortable category of an interrupted life, with no obvious rupture. For months, deputies canvassed businesses along the highway, noting who worked late shifts and who traveled after dark. They reviewed gas station logs, motel registries, and bar tabs, the routine work of narrowing a wide field. Witness recollections were imperfect. Some remembered seeing Melissa speaking with a man near the store lot. Others recalled a pickup idling near the curb. Each statement was recorded, cross-checked, and set aside when it failed corroboration. The absence of urgency and public response was not indifference. It was the quiet nature of a town that believed its own safety. Media coverage remained local and measured. The weekly paper ran updates near Thanksgiving, urging anyone with information to call. By Christmas, the story receded beneath holiday advertisements and weather advisories. The investigation continued, but resources were finite. When spring returned, the ravine remained frozen in the file, a location known only to maps and memory. The discovery that December forced a reckoning. Evidence was cataloged anew, and the state crime lab assisted with soil analysis and fiber examination. A single foreign fiber, consistent with upholstery, was recovered from clothing remnants. Tire impressions were inconclusive but suggested a light truck. The path from the turnout to the ravine indicated deliberate placement, not accident. The timeline was narrowed to a window after Melissa left work, before dawn weather worsened. Detectives revisited old interviews with a colder eye. One name resurfaced repeatedly on the periphery, never central enough to charge but present. Thomas Eugene Calder, 34 in 1988, worked seasonal construction and drove a tan pickup. He had offered rides to employees during storms, a kindness remembered without suspicion at the time. His statements placed him on the highway that night. His alibi relied on a bar receipt, later found to be misstated due to a register error documented months later. Calder had moved out of county in 1989, a common story in a region tied to logging cycles. Without probable cause, the trail cooled. Years passed. Technology changed. The case remained open, reviewed periodically by new detectives who summarized it in margins and sticky notes. Melissa's parents aged, attending hearings for other matters, carrying a private calendar that never moved past Easter. In 2015, the department initiated a cold case audit, prompted by grant funding and renewed attention to unresolved homicides. Boxes were inventoried. Evidence was sent for modern analysis. The fiber, once limited to category, was compared using updated databases. It matched a specific upholstery fabric used in late 1980's pickups manufactured by a regional supplier. The list was not long. Investigators located Calder in eastern Washington. Records showed a later arrest for an unrelated offense, and his vehicle history included a tan pickup of the relevant make, sold in 1990. A search warrant was obtained for remaining property. Items recovered included an old seat cover stored in a shed. Laboratory comparison indicated consistency with the fiber recovered decades earlier. It was not definitive alone, but it was enough to proceed carefully. Further work focused on corroboration. Phone records were reconstructed where possible. Employment logs placed Calder off work the night Melissa disappeared. Whether data confirmed hazardous conditions that would have made walking difficult. A former coworker, interviewed again after years, recalled Calder mentioning a girl needing a ride the morning after Easter, a statement previously dismissed as vague. Memory is fragile, but consistency matters. In 2018, prosecutors reviewed the file. They weighed the evidence, mindful of the burden. Additional forensic testing identified trace soil on the seat cover consistent with the Ravine's composition. It did not prove guilt alone, but the accumulation told a coherent story. Calder was arrested quietly, without spectacle, charged with second-degree murder. The community reacted with disbelief tempered by recognition. Time had not erased responsibility. The trial occurred in a small courthouse with winter light filtering through tall windows. Experts testified to methods, limitations, and findings. The defense challenged gaps and age. The jury listened, attentive to process over drama. After deliberation, a verdict was returned. Calder was convicted and sentenced according to statute, the law applied without flourish. Melissa Ann Rourke's name was spoken in court, recorded in final orders, and printed again in the local paper, this time with resolution. The ravine returned to snow and silence. Files were closed, not forgotten, and the town entered another winter carrying the knowledge that patience and method had finally answered a long-held question. In the months following the verdict, the sheriff's office documented lessons learned, noting the value of preserving even marginal evidence and the importance of revisiting assumptions formed under pressure. The cold case unit formalized procedures for seasonal disappearances, recognizing how winter conditions can obscure movement and delay discovery. Training emphasized meticulous logging, chain of custody, and humility before time's distortions. The legal aftermath extended beyond sentencing. Appeals were filed and denied, grounded in procedural review rather than spectacle. The conviction stood, Melissa's family established a small scholarship at the local college, a practical memorial aligned with her plans. Each December, a brief notice appeared in the paper acknowledging the anniversary, restrained and factual, reflecting the community's character. The ravine was surveyed once more for closure, its coordinates recorded with care. No additional evidence was found and none was expected. The place became ordinary again, visited by deer and hikers, the land indifferent to human accounting. The highway continued to carry trucks north and south, salt trucks first, then plows, then summer traffic, the cycle unbroken. For investigators who had inherited the file, the resolution offered a quiet satisfaction. It reaffirmed the discipline of patience, the necessity of procedure, and the moral weight of follow-through. The case demonstrated that even in small towns with limited resources and imperfect tools, lawful persistence could prevail. By the next Christmas, the courthouse steps were lit with a modest display, and the town moved forward. The file labeled Idaho 1988 was archived with a final stamp. Melissa Ann Rourke's story remained in records and memory, a reminder that the passage of years does not absolve, and that answers, when they arrive without noise. These pages now rest in cold storage, consulted occasionally by trainees who study timelines, weather charts, and the quiet rigor required to bring truth into the light without haste, anger, or spectacle, only work done carefully, correctly, and in time. The winter ended, but accountability endured, recorded faithfully in public archives. The second phase of the investigation unfolded slowly, shaped by routine rather than revelation, as detectives turned from discovery to reconstruction. Every step was documented with an awareness that age had eroded memory and degraded material, and that conclusions would need to rest on accumulation, not a single decisive finding. The case file grew thicker, organized by date, location, and source, reflecting the deliberate pace of a department accustomed to winter roads and long waits. Melissa Ann Rourke's movements during the weeks before her disappearance were charted with care. Pay stubs confirmed her schedule, and time cards showed consistent hours leading into the Easter weekend. Store surveillance had not survived the years, but maintenance logs confirmed cameras were operational then, an absence noted rather than lamented. Receipts from nearby businesses were examined for pattern, and while none captured her image, they established traffic levels and weather-related delays consistent with the timeline. Investigators revisited the grocery store parking lot, standing where she likely stood, measuring distances to streetlights and exits. The lot had been resurfaced, but original plans were found in municipal records, allowing reconstruction of sightlines. It was determined that a vehicle could have stopped briefly without drawing attention, especially during a sleet storm when visibility narrowed and urgency governed movement. The autopsy report, reviewed again, was a document of limits as much as findings. The medical examiner noted the effects of prolonged exposure, stating with restraint that the cause of death could not be specified beyond homicidal violence. There were no defensive injuries preserved, no clear instrument identified. The report emphasized context, location, concealment, and absence of personal items suggested intent. That conclusion guided investigators without dictating method. Witness statements from 1988 were retyped and digitized, preserving original wording. Discrepancies were highlighted but not exaggerated. Memory drift was expected, and detectives focused on consistencies that survived repetition. Several witnesses recalled a tan pickup seen idling near the store that night. One described a cracked tail light. Another remembered the engine's rough idle. None could identify a driver with certainty, but the vehicle details aligned with Thomas Eugene, Calder's known truck. Calder's early interviews were reviewed line by line. His demeanor was noted as cooperative, his statements concise. He placed himself on Highway 95, consistent with work patterns. The bar receipt he cited had been accepted at the time, but later audits revealed the register's clock ran 12 hours off during a power interruption. This fact had been documented in a maintenance log but not connected to the case until years later. It reframed his alibi without proving deception. Detectives traced Calder's movements after 1988. He relocated for work, married briefly, divorced, and held seasonal jobs. There was no pattern of violence in his record, a fact weighed carefully. The absence of prior offenses did not exculpate, but it underscored the need for restraint. Investigators sought corroboration through physical evidence rather than character inference. The fiber analysis became a focal point. Originally categorized broadly, it was re-examined with updated microscopy and chemical profiling. The result narrowed the source to a specific upholstery blend used in limited production runs. Vehicle registration databases were cross-referenced with employment records, producing a small pool. Calder's truck fell within it. The finding did not stand alone, but it anchored further inquiry. Search warrants were pursued methodically. Affidavits outlined probable cause grounded in cumulative facts: opportunity, vehicle match, fiber consistency, and alibi concerns. Judges reviewed them carefully, mindful of elapsed time. When approved, searches were conducted without fanfare. Items were cataloged, photographed, and sealed. The old seat cover was treated as a potential bridge between eras, handled with gloves and patience. Laboratory comparisons followed strict protocols. Analysts testified later to margins of error and the importance of context. Soil samples from the ravine were compared to trace found on the seat cover, revealing mineral similarities consistent with the area's composition. Again, not proof alone, but part of a pattern. Each result was logged, reviewed, and peer-checked. Investigators also examined Calder's statements over time. In 1988, he denied offering rides that night. In later conversations, he acknowledged sometimes doing so during storms. The shift was subtle, explained as faulty memory, but noted. Consistency matters not because inconsistency proves guilt, but because it informs reliability. Detectives documented changes without assigning motive. Community context was considered. Sandpoint in the late 1980s was small, interconnected, and cautious. Rides were common during storms. That reality complicated interpretation. What distinguished this case was not the act of offering help, but the convergence of evidence placing Calder with means and opportunity at a critical moment. As the case advanced toward prosecutorial review, detectives prepared summaries designed to withstand scrutiny. Timelines were rebuilt with weather data, traffic counts, and known events. The sleet storm that night reduced pedestrian movement, increasing the likelihood that Melissa accepted a ride. The ravine's proximity to the highway made it accessible without attracting attention, especially after dark. Media interest returned gradually. Reporters requested records, and the department released information measuredly, avoiding speculation. The tone remained factual, reflecting an understanding that public confidence rests on transparency without prejudice. Melissa's family was notified of developments before any announcement, a practice emphasized in departmental policy. When Calder was approached again, he declined further interviews on counsel's advice. Investigators respected the decision, documenting contact and moving forward. The case no longer depended on statements. It depended on whether the assembled evidence met legal thresholds. Prosecutors evaluated admissibility, chain of custody, and the risk of prejudice due to time. They consulted experts on cold case dynamics and jury perception. The decision to charge was not rushed. It followed months of review, mock examinations, and ethical consideration. When charges were filed, they were precise, reflecting statutes applicable at the time of offense. The arrest was executed without spectacle. Calder was taken into custody at his residence, informed of charges, and transported. There were no public statements beyond confirmation. The community reacted quietly, absorbing the news through the local paper and evening broadcasts. Shock was present, but so was recognition of the process that led there. Pretrial motions addressed evidence age and relevance. Judges ruled carefully, allowing testimony with appropriate context. Experts were instructed to explain limitations plainly. The goal was clarity, not persuasion. The courtroom atmosphere reflected winter restraint, coats hung neatly, voices low. Throughout proceedings, investigators maintained logs of every action, anticipating appellate review. The case represented not only a pursuit of accountability, but a test of whether methodical work could bridge decades. Each day in court reaffirmed the importance of documentation begun long ago by deputies who could not have known how long the file would wait. By the time testimony concluded, the narrative was clear without embellishment. A young woman disappeared during a storm. Evidence placed her with a specific vehicle and driver. Her remains were found where access and concealment aligned with opportunity. Physical traces connected place to object. Alibi inconsistencies weakened alternative explanations. The law weighed these facts collectively. As deliberations began, winter settled again outside the courthouse. Snow fell steadily, familiar and unremarkable. Inside, jurors reviewed exhibits and instructions, mindful of responsibility. The case asked for judgment grounded in reason, not emotion, and the process had been built to support that end. When the verdict was returned, it carried the weight of years. It was recorded formally, read without flourish, and entered into the record. The work of investigators shifted to documentation and transition, preparing the file for final archiving once appeals concluded. The second chapter of the case thus closed not with revelation, but with confirmation that patient accumulation can withstand time. It affirmed that even when winter obscures paths and years dull memory, careful procedure can still assemble a coherent account, one page at a time, until the record speaks clearly enough for the law to act. The third movement of the case centered on the courtroom and the disciplined translation of investigation into record. It was here that years of methodical work were tested against standards designed to protect fairness. Every exhibit carried a history, every document a chain, and every conclusion a margin. The prosecution presented the story without dramatization, mindful that the audience was a jury asked to weigh facts, not emotion. Jurors were guided through the timeline slowly. Weather reports from the Easter weekend of 1988 were introduced, establishing the sleet storm that limited visibility and discouraged walking. Traffic data from Highway 95 demonstrated reduced flow during the hours Melissa Ann Rourke disappeared, increasing the likelihood that a stopped vehicle would not attract notice. These contextual elements were not evidence of guilt, but they framed probability, an important distinction repeated throughout proceedings. The identification of Melissa was revisited with care. Dental records, the recovered ring, and clothing remnants were explained by forensic specialists who emphasized certainty and limits. The Ravine location was mapped precisely, showing access points and distance from the roadway. Photographs were clinical and restrained, presented to document placement rather than provoke reaction. The jury was instructed on how to view such material objectively. Attention then shifted to the vehicle evidence. Analysts described the upholstery fiber, its manufacturing period and rarity. Charts illustrated the narrowing process from broad category to specific blend. Defense cross-examination focused on overlap and possibility, and experts acknowledged it openly. The strength of the evidence lay not in exclusivity, but in convergence with other findings. This principle guided much of the case. The seat cover recovered from Thomas Eugene Calder's property was introduced next. Chain of custody documentation traced it from shed to laboratory. Soil comparison testimony followed, explaining mineral composition and regional specificity. Again, limitations were addressed plainly. The jury heard that such analysis cannot identify a single location with absolute certainty, but can exclude many others. The ravine's geology fit within the consistent range. Investigators testified about the alibi discrepancy. The bar receipt was presented alongside the maintenance log documenting the register's clock error. The explanation was technical and mundane, exactly the kind of detail that often decides cases quietly. It showed how a small administrative note, preserved without intent, later altered interpretation. The jury was reminded that the receipt's flaw did not prove deceit, but removed certainty. Witness statements from 1988 were summarized through officers who conducted the original interviews. The court allowed their admission under rules governing recorded recollections. Variations were acknowledged. Consistencies regarding the tan pickup and its presence near the store were highlighted. No witness claimed to see Melissa enter a vehicle, and the prosecution did not imply otherwise. The emphasis remained on reasonable inference, not assertion. The defense presented its case methodically, focusing on the passage of time, memory decay, and alternative explanations. They argued that kindness during storms was common, that vehicle similarities were not unique, and that soil and fiber evidence could travel innocently. These arguments were expected and addressed through rebuttal testimony clarifying probability versus possibility. Throughout, the judge maintained a tone of procedural calm. Objections were ruled on promptly, jurors instructed frequently. The courtroom atmosphere reflected the seriousness of deciding a matter that had waited decades. There were no outbursts, no visible reactions. Even the verdict, when it came, was received in silence. After conviction, the sentencing phase proceeded according to statute. Victim impact statements were submitted in writing, read without flourish. The court imposed a sentence aligned with guidelines in effect at the time of offense, accounting for factors established by law. The judgment included provisions for parole eligibility consistent with statute, a reminder that punishment operates within defined bounds. The aftermath moved away from the courtroom and back into records. Appeals were filed as a matter of course, focusing on evidentiary rulings and the admission of decades-old testimony. Appellate courts reviewed transcripts and exhibits, applying standards without regard to sentiment. Decisions affirmed the lower court, noting the careful handling of limitations and the absence of prejudicial error. For the sheriff's office, the case entered a final administrative phase. Evidence was inventoried for long-term storage or lawful disposal. Digital copies of records were archived with redundancy. The cold case unit updated its manual, incorporating lessons learned about early evidence preservation, documentation of peripheral details, and the value of periodic review. Melissa Ann Rourke's family received formal notice of the appellate outcome. There were no press conferences. The local paper ran a brief update, factual and restrained. Community response was muted, reflecting a culture that processes grief privately. Conversations occurred in kitchens and over coffee, not in public forums. Seasonal markers continued to frame memory. Thanksgiving arrived with its routines, followed by Christmas lights along the main street. For some, these dates carried added weight, reminders of when Melissa vanished and when she was found. The town acknowledged this quietly, through absence of rumor and respect for fact. Investigators who had worked the case retired or moved on. New deputies learned of it during training, studying how small details accumulated meaning. The case became a reference point, not a legend. It illustrated how winter conditions complicate timelines, how rural geography offers concealment, and how patience remains an investigative tool. The ravine itself changed little. Vegetation grew back. Foot traffic increased slightly as the area became part of a managed trail. There were no markers. The land did not claim the story, records did. Maps noted coordinates, but meaning resided in files stored in climate-controlled rooms. In the years following closure, the department received occasional inquiries from journalists and researchers. Responses remained consistent, pointing to court records and emphasizing the lawful process. There was no interest in revisiting speculation. The case had reached its legal conclusion. The quiet aftermath also included accountability beyond conviction. The department conducted an internal review of early investigative decisions, not to assign blame, but to identify missed opportunities. It noted the limitations of technology in 1988 and the reasonable judgments made then. It also identified where follow-up could have been more rigorous, lessons now codified. Melissa Ann Rourke's name appeared one final time in official correspondence when the case was formally reclassified as solved. The designation carried administrative significance, closing reporting loops and updating state statistics. It did not change loss, but it changed record. As winter returned year after year, the story settled into its place in local history. Not as a cautionary tale filled with drama, but as an example of how ordinary work, done carefully and revisited honestly, can eventually answer questions left by time. The third chapter thus concluded not with triumph, but with confirmation that the system, when patient and precise, can still function across decades. The final stage of the Idaho 1988 case unfolded after the courtroom emptied and attention shifted from verdict to consequence. Legal closure did not arrive as a single moment, but as a series of confirmations recorded quietly in files, letters, and administrative logs. The conviction of Thomas Eugene Calder marked an end to uncertainty, yet the work of resolution extended beyond sentencing into the routines of record-keeping and remembrance. Once appeals were exhausted and the judgment affirmed, the district court issued its mandate. The language was formal and restrained, citing statutes and dates rather than emotion. Calder was transferred to the custody of the State Corrections Department, where intake records noted age, health, and sentence length. There were no unusual accommodations, no special status. The case concluded as the law intended, through procedure rather than display. For the sheriff's office, final documentation became a priority. Evidence inventories were reconciled against original logs dating back to 1988. Items no longer required for appeal were either preserved for historical record or disposed of according to policy, each action signed and dated. Digital archives were updated with redundant storage, ensuring that future audits would find a complete and coherent trail. The Cold Case Unit prepared a final summary report. It outlined the discovery, investigative steps, forensic advancements, prosecutorial decisions, and outcomes. The report avoided speculation and emphasized methodology. Its purpose was instructional as much as historical, intended for training and accountability. It acknowledged limitations faced in the original investigation and credited the persistence that eventually bridged decades. Melissa Ann Rourke's family received official notification of the case's final status. The letter was direct, confirming that no further legal action was pending. There were no promises of peace, only confirmation that the process had concluded. Family members responded privately, expressing gratitude for the work done without public statements or ceremonies. The community absorbed the end of the case in its own manner. The local paper published a short notice confirming the appeal decision and sentence. It ran alongside weather forecasts and holiday announcements, reflecting the town's preference for balance rather than fixation. There were no editorials, no calls for retrospection. The facts stood on their own. As Thanksgiving approached, familiar rituals returned. Grocery stores filled with seasonal displays and traffic increased along Highway 95. For longtime residents, the season carried layered memory. Some recalled the missing person flyers that once hung in shop windows. Others remembered the December morning when the ravine became a crime scene. Now, those memories settled into a quieter register, acknowledged but no longer unresolved. Christmas arrived with its usual markers. Lights lined Main Street. Snow fell steadily, then melted, then returned. The courthouse closed for the holiday, its files resting behind locked doors. Inside those files, Melissa's name remained, not as a question but as a resolved entry, dated and signed. Resolution did not erase loss, but it replaced uncertainty with record. The sheriff addressed deputies at a year-end briefing, referencing the case briefly. He emphasized the importance of documentation, patience, and respect for evidence regardless of apparent significance. He reminded them that future cases would one day become past cases, and that their notes might matter long after they retired. The message was practical, grounded in experience. In the years following closure, the case influenced policy in subtle ways. Missing person protocols were updated to include seasonal risk assessments. Evidence storage standards were revised to anticipate long-term preservation. Cold case reviews were scheduled at regular intervals rather than prompted by funding alone. None of these changes bore Melissa's name, but they carried the imprint of lessons learned. The ravine near the highway remained unmarked. Hikers passed without notice. Snow covered it each winter, then receded. Nature offered no commentary on human affairs. The land did not remember, but the records did, maintained in climate-controlled rooms where temperature and humidity were monitored carefully, ensuring longevity of paper and data alike. Former investigators occasionally revisited the file for training sessions. They pointed out how early assumptions narrowed focus, how peripheral details later gained significance, and how restraint preserved credibility. The case was presented not as a triumph, but as an example of endurance within constraints. Younger officers listened, understanding that most investigations conclude without headlines. Melissa Ann Rourke's name appeared once more in a different context when a small scholarship was awarded at a local college. The announcement was modest, noting her age and aspirations. It aligned with the family's desire for practicality rather than memorialization. Education, not spectacle, became the enduring association. Years passed. The community changed gradually. New businesses opened, others closed, roads were widened then repaved. Yet the case remained a reference point for how the town understood justice, deliberate, quiet, and grounded in work rather than rhetoric. It reinforced trust not through perfection but through follow-through. The final administrative act occurred when the case status was updated in state and federal databases. The designation shifted from unsolved to solved, closing reporting loops that fed national statistics. It was a small checkbox, but one that mattered to accuracy and to families who track such designations closely. Winter returned again, as it always did. Snow fell on the courthouse steps, melted, and refroze. Inside, the Idaho 1988 file rested among others, no longer active but never discarded. It existed as proof that time complicates truth but does not nullify it, and that lawful persistence can still assemble answers from fragments left behind. For those who followed the case from beginning to end, the conclusion offered neither relief nor celebration, only a sense of completion. The story did not end with a dramatic turn, but with a final signature, a closed folder, and the quiet understanding that justice, when it arrives late, arrives without noise. Melissa Ann Rourke's life was brief, her absence long, and her case a testament to the value of careful work done without expectation of recognition. The winters that framed her disappearance and discovery now frame her resolution. The record stands complete, preserved in public files, available to anyone who seeks to understand how a small town, a patient investigation, and the passage of years finally converged on truth.